What is up, everyone? I am TST's the Mudman, and it's time to figure out what we are going to play this weekend ranked in Gods Unchained. So it's been about 3 weeks since we've seen a balance patch, so I'm sure everyone has a pretty good understanding of what the mythic meta is like. Light is the most popular domain by far, Zoo Light being their most popular archetype, but Control Light is definitely the stronger of the two archetypes. So let's jump into a quick aggro light list as well as a control light list and break down what makes them so good and how to counter them if possible. Alright, so this Zoo Light list made by Meepo is a great example of a standard Zoo Light deck. Um, we've discussed Zoo Light on this series a ton of times. Their strategy is very simple. I'll give you a quick abridged version. They spend their first couple of turns just playing a bunch of early game creatures, 1 mana creatures, 2 mana creatures, and then they buff all those creatures with something like Radiant Dawn, then something again at the 4 mana slot. The 4 mana buff slot is up for interpretation. Sometimes there's Holy Enchanters, sometimes there's Protected Benedictions, sometimes there's this random legendary. But there's always some sort of 4 mana buff card as well, and then we move into the 5 mana slot for Prayer of the Desperate, and then finally Asterius. So, as you can see from the curve, there are 16 cards that cost 1 or 2 mana. So realistically, you're never going to whiff on an early game. You're never going to be in a situation where you have nothing to play turn 1. You always have some sort of decent creature to play, and then you can capitalize on them with your many buffs. And since you have so many different variations of buffs, you're also going to have one of these buff cards in your hand when you produce a board worth buffing. So the deck is just full of lots of redundancies, and it's very easy to build a board, and it's very easy to capitalize on that board state. Light also has lots of powerful echo cards. You have your Home Guard Protector, which sort of capitalize on all the AoE board buffs even more, since this is one single card that represents 2 bodies on the board. Light has lots of great echo cards. There's obviously the Home Guard Protector. There's also the Humble Benefactor. Just very easy ways for Light to build a very large board presence and then continuously capitalize on them until their board state is just too big to be easily removed, and then they overwhelm their opponent. So a great way to defeat these aggro light lists is with war decks. If you're a fan of this series, and you've definitely heard me discuss that war is just very well equipped to deal with Zoo Light. War has lots of blitz creatures, as well as relics. You can see we have the Tavern Brawler in this deck. We have the Wolf Cult Vanguard, which is extra good. It has blitz if you use the Empower effect. It has blitz and Twin Strike, so this single card can destroy 2, maybe even 3 of your light opponent's creatures. Relics are also good for those 2-for-1 type things. As you can see, Blade of Six has 2 durability. So you can play it, destroy your light opponent's creature, and the next turn destroy another creature. And since Light plays lots of creatures but has essentially no card draw, if you can get a lot of 2-for-1s against Light, or against Zoo Light rather, then you will be able to defeat them. And just also as a quick side note, this deck made by Play Hearthstone was the best performing deck over the weekend. Light was incredibly popular, but any type of war deck, mainly these relic war decks, are very well equipped to beat aggro light as well as control light. So let's jump into a quick control light list and go over that. This list was made by Ryan. We've been showing off his control light list since control light became a thing. He is the pioneer behind the archetype. This deck is very, very similar to the one that we showed off from him last week. It's very stall oriented. He has lots of order cards. This can turn off a creature or 2 creatures for a few turns. We've got the Inquisitor that can turn off a creature. There's obviously Cern. Lips Are Sealed is a great way to turn off just multiple creatures for many turns. We have Line in the Sand, which is just sleep that can't be countered by sleep removal. Then, of course, Lysander's Mercy. And using your infinite value generator in Radiant Embalmer plus Inescapable Duty, you can just play any creature you want over and over again for infinite value or tempo. If you play enough 6 to 8 Demogorgons, you're going to eventually win. Or if you're playing like a very aggressive opponent, maybe a Zoo Light opponent who just continuously buffs their board, you can use your Radiant Embalmer to just get Lips or Seals indefinitely and just keep turning off your aggro opponent's board. It can be a big Zoo Light opponent, it can be an aggro nature opponent, any god that's going to make a big board and buff them. You can just use Lips or Seal to essentially just beat them with that. And then your Archpriest of Parthene just gets mega huge, and he can just be your main win condition. Essentially, this deck is just really, really good at stalling, and then you'll just play big creatures indefinitely until you win. Now, like I said just a moment ago, these aggro war decks, or aggro war is a bad term for them, these like relic war decks are also very well equipped to beat control light. So I said before, when you're playing Zoo Light, your main strategy is to run them out of resources, but you can't run Control Light out of resources because their main gimmick is they have infinite resources. Well, that's where the primary win condition of this deck really comes in. We have the 2 copies of Unrestrained Power, which gives your relic +2 strength and then doubles its power if you use the Empower effect. You have your Mobilize to draw your combo and then also reduce the cost of it. Your I need a weapons to get the big weapons. So, I'm sure you can put together what I'm putting down. You're going to make a really big relic. And although Control Light has access to a lot of healing with their God Power and cards like CERN or Helmna or that 1-mana card that draws you a card and heals you for 3, like Light has a lot of different ways they can heal, but they can't heal a lot at one time. They're not like something like Death that can play a bunch of just nibbles and return to caves. They can really only heal in small increments. So if you can make one giant relic, like a 14 attack relic, and attack them a couple times, you'll probably be able to win, and you can just negate their infinite value engine by making a big relic and hitting them in the face very, very hard. And that's the main reason why a war deck like this performed so well last weekend, is because it has great game against both Light archetypes, and Light is just extremely popular. But these Control Light lists are also moderately weak to Dralamar Magic. As you saw, this deck does have a copy of Odessa, which sort of turns off Dralamar. I talked about this last week. Like, this makes it so if you have an Odessa on the board, your opponent can't just play Dralamar. They have to destroy Odessa first, but it's not like it's hard to destroy Odessa, so it just turns off Dralamar for one turn. But it's something you can do. But seeing as that this is the only measure the Light has to stop Dralamar, and it doesn't do a great job of it, you can potentially also beat Control Light with Dralamar Magic. That being said, Dralamar Magic will get farmed by Zoo Light because they're just not proactive enough, and Zoo Light will just make a big board and go face very, very hard. And Zoo Light's the most common Light archetype. So you're only going to want to play Dralamar Magic if you want to specifically counter Control Light, which is not going to be that common, but it is something that you can think about. All in all, the best counter for the Light decks will be some sort of relic-oriented war deck that has lots of Blitz creatures and Twin Strike creatures. Alright, now let's move on to Magic. We talked about Dralamar Magic a little bit. Dralamar Magic is great against Control Light, but Control Light is not the most popular Light archetype. Control Magic is great against Zoo Light, which is the most popular archetype in the game right now. This deck is really similar to the one that we showcased last week. The strategy is also very similar. You are just clearing the board in the early and mid game, and then you're playing big creatures to overwhelm your opponent. As you can see, we have lots of ways to remove cards in the early game. There's Ancient Text, there's Star Shard Bolts, there's Tracking Bolts, there's the Lightning Talisman, there's 2 Unannounced Arrivals, there's 2 Shape Blasts because they're great. Only 1 copy of Unbound Flames, but there's a lot of AoE removal. Of course, you have a single copy of Street Conjure, which you can pair with any of those AoE cards to make them even better. And then as you move into the late game, you can deal a lot of damage with your Ley Horde hatchlings. You can play a giant warded dragon, a big Helmna, maybe some Helion elites. The strategy is very simple, but it's very, very good against a deck like Zoo Light. Just like we said when I was talking about the war deck, if you can get a lot of 2-for-1s against Zoo Light, you're going to be in a great position. And all of these AoE spells can get way more than just 2-for-1. You might get 6-for-1, for all you know. This deck is definitely way, way weaker against something like Control Light. Control Light can just outvalue them. It doesn't really matter how much AoE Magic has. Light has infinite creatures. Or, Control Light, rather, has infinite creatures. A similar thing can be said for, like, Dralamar Magic. This deck really doesn't have any way to stop Dralamar. You can play Lightning Talisman, but, similar to Odessa, if you're playing Dralamar Magic and your opponent plays Lightning Talisman, just get rid of the Lightning Talisman before you do the stuff. If you don't know, Lightning Talisman has changed in the last balance patch. Before, if your board was empty and you damaged your opponent's face, the Lightning Talisman wouldn't activate. Now it does activate, so you can just God Power your opponent's face a couple of times so the Lightning Talisman's gone, and then do your Dralamar combo, no big deal. So this deck has very little game against Dralamar Magic or against Control Light, but those archetypes are not very common. What is common is Zoo Light, and this is great against Zoo Light. So if you don't like War and you don't like Light, but you still want to beat up on the Light opponents, then a Control Magic deck like this one could be a great choice for you. Alright, next up we have Aggro Deception. This list was made by Ko, I think is how that's pronounced. And Aggro Deception is another archetype that has been historically good against Zoo Light. Aggro Deception was the best deck in the game a few weeks ago. it has been nerfed and it's no longer anywhere near as good as it used to be. But the reason it was good against Zoo Light still remains. Aggro Deception has lots and lots of hidden creatures, and Zoo Light has a very hard time interacting with hidden creatures. So ideally, you can play a bunch of hidden stuff, buff them up, go face, and then outrace your Zoo Light opponent. That being said, Zoo Light can also be very, very fast, so it's less consistent than it was a few weeks ago. Now it's more of a toss-up whether you can outrace your light opponent. But this deck does have a copy of Rapture Dance in here for some big AoE removal in case their Zoo Light or I guess Zoo Nature opponent gets out of hand. But essentially speaking, this is a very standard like Zoo or Aggro Deception list. We have the little guild package with the Fermentari Instigator. There's lots of guild creatures in here, so you can draw lots of cards. Lots of weak echo creatures, which are great targets for your Reflection Elementalist to turn into big creatures. Just normal Aggro Deception stuff. There is one card in here in particular that I definitely want to mention, and that is the single copy of Cutthroat Insight. In the past, I've been very anti having Cutthroat in aggro decks, just because it's an anti-tempo card. It's 5 mana that does nothing to the board at all. However, in this current meta, there is a lot of merit for Cutthroat. If you're playing against like a true blue OTK combo deck like Dralamar, Portal Wrangler, School Teacher, Cutthroat just wins you the game guaranteed. You take their Dralamar, their Portal Wrangler, their School Teacher, and they have no more deck. It's also very good against like the multi-turn combo decks. If you're playing against Death and you take their Land of the Dead, they're not really capable of dealing anywhere near as much damage as they could have with 2 Lands of the Dead. The exact same thing is true against War. You can steal their Unrestrained Power, and now they are way worse at doing lots of damage. Obviously, it's not going to help you at all in those Zoo Light matchups. You could pip into Cutthroat and take a Prayer of the Desperate, but just like I said when we were talking about Zoo Light, they have a lot of redundancies. If you take one Prayer of the Desperate, they still have the second Prayer, they still have Asterius, they still have Radiant Dawns, they still have whatever they have at 4. So it's never going to help you against Zoo Light, but it is incredibly good against Control Light. Let me paint you a quick picture with my imagination brush. So you're playing against Control Light, and you have just one copy of Cutthroat Insight in your deck. You play that Cutthroat, you take a Radiant Bomber. Now you have Radiant Bomber. You play Radiant Bomber, and you get back another Cutthroat. Now you can Cutthroat again. Maybe you take the second Radiant Bomber and rinse and repeat. Maybe you take an Inescapable Duty, and then you get Radiant Bomber and get another Cutthroat. So what I'm getting at is with one copy of one well-timed Cutthroat getting a Radiant Bomber, you can essentially steal the entire infinite value loop of your Control Light opponent, with just one single card. So this can be absolutely devastating against Control Light. Like I've been saying this whole video, Zoo Light is the more popular archetype. Control Light is way less popular than Zoo Light, but like I was saying before, this is good against Death, it's good against Magic, it's good against War, it's good against enough things I think it's worth a spot in the deck, and it's just so great against Light. You can just take their NFTs all day long with just a single Cutthroat Insight. So if you are a fan of the Aggro Deception list and you want to have game against literally any deck in the game, then an aggressive list like this with a single Cutthroat could be a great choice for you. Alright, and the last archetype to go over is a Nubian Death. This list was made by Darkle. And, a Nubian Death, it's not the most popular archetype, but it's definitely pretty strong. The strategy is very simple. You kill off your own Nubians while you have some key ones on the board, like your Priestess of Taket or your Raving Necromancer. That way, every time you kill off one of your own Nubians, you'll be dealing damage to your opponent. This deck also has 2 copies of Skull Scepter to even further capitalize on destroying your own Nubians, just to end the game much faster, which is very good. We have 2 copies of Curse of Greed in here, which is a really great card against, Zoo Light for the most part. They always play early game creatures, and then they make them really big. This is a 2-mana card that can destroy any early game creature. It can also make you an heirloom if you really want, so it's quite good in those Zoo Light matchups. And then of course you have Land of the Dead, so you can put all of your Nubians back onto the board, kill them off all at once, and then just deal lots and lots of damage to kill your opponent. This deck also has a copy of Heirloom Death's alternate win condition, the Quorum of Pharaoh's Past. This card doesn't see play that often, mainly because 2 Land of the Deads, or even just 1 Land of the Dead, is often enough to win you the game. However, it is possible to tech against Land of the Dead. Control Light rather, has Yukos, which can give Key Nubians Soulless, so they don't go in the void, therefore you can't bring them back. Control Light also has Divine Judgment, which just removes cards from the game entirely. So if you get into a situation where your key Nubians are gone, or maybe all of your blitzers got soulless and you have nothing to bring back, you can always play Quorum of Pharaoh's Past, which deals 2 damage for every single heirloom that you've generated into your hand, every heirloom that you've played, pretty much every heirloom that you've seen, you're dealing 2 damage for it. So if you do happen to run into someone who's put Gleam Weavers in their deck, or you run into a lot of Control Light players who Yukos you at the right times, then your Quorum of Pharaoh's Past can be a great alternate win condition. That being said, when you do play against Control Light opponents, so when you queue into a game and you see your light opponent picked heal or anything besides the creature one, you're going to want to kill off your Priestess of Taket and or Raving Necromancer the turn you play it. So you're going to want to pair it with something like Untold Greed. This deck doesn't have any copy. Oh, it does have Ragnarok. Yeah, so you can play it alongside a Ragnarok. Just guarantee it gets into your Void so you can have a big Land of the Dead turn. Don't give them the opportunity to remove it from the game with Divine Judgment or give it Soulless with Yukos. You're going to want to kill it off yourself, even if it does mean you're dealing less damage when you first play it. Yeah, but all in all, a Nubian Death, not the flashiest deck. Still very strong. You will do well. Zoo Light is not the greatest matchup. Zoo Light is known for playing lots of creatures, which is important for killing off your Nubians. So if you like a Nubian Death, this could be a good list for you. Alright, so now it is conclusion time. We've done all the thinking, we've done all the talking, we've clicked on all the tabs. What should we play this weekend ranked in Gods Unchained? Well, if you want to ride the light bandwagon, then Control Light is definitely the best list you can use, or the best archetype you can play, rather. That makes more sense. And Ryan's list is one of the premier Control Light lists on the block right now. But if you want to go anti-light, then a relic-oriented war deck will be very, very strong. Just like I said when we were talking about war, this is good against both Zoo Light and Control Light. So if you don't like light and you do like winning, then a war deck like this could be a great choice for you. But whatever deck you choose, try to have fun, tell us how you did in the TST Discord, and have a wonderful day. Hey, you! Did you know that subscribing to the TST YouTube channel will increase your win rate by 6.9%? So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for notifications. And while you're at it, equip Scythe of the Harvest and attack the like button directly in the face. Bye-bye!